The first sign was the tremor in her left hand. It had been there since dawn, a faint unsteadiness that Leonora Hale noticed when she lifted the teacup in her bedchamber and watched the surface of the liquid shiver against the porcelain rim. She set the cup down without drinking. The tremor was not new. It had begun some weeks ago, in the quiet privacy of mornings when no one watched, and she had told no one. Not her father, who had already given so much to see her standing at this altar. Not the modiste who had pinned the ivory silk so carefully around her narrowing frame. Not Dr. Ellsworth, who had attended her since childhood and would have insisted on postponement, which would have meant questions, and questions would have meant the end of everything Sir Geoffrey Hale had worked to arrange. She pressed her hand flat against the dressing table until the tremor stilled, and then she stood and allowed the maid to finish lacing the gown. The Church of St. Michael stood at the edge of Ashbury village, its stone walls warmed by late May sunshine that fell in long, pale columns through the nave windows. 300 guests filled the pews. Half the county, the Dowager Duchess had said with satisfaction when the final acceptances arrived, as though the number were a personal achievement. And perhaps it was. Julian Blackmore, 5th Duke of Ashbury, did not marry quietly. His mother had made certain of that. The wedding was an event designed to confirm the family's standing after 2 difficult years. The old duke's debts settled, the estate restored, the son finally doing what sons of rank were expected to do. Julian himself stood at the chancel rail with the stillness of a man performing a duty he had accepted without enthusiasm and without complaint. He had met Leonora Hale 4 times before proposing. She was the daughter of a baronet of modest fortune and excellent reputation. She was not beautiful in the way London talked about, not the kind of beauty that drew whispers at Almack's or invitations to be painted. She was instead the kind of woman one noticed on a second glance and could not afterwards forget. There was something in the way she held herself, a quality of attentiveness, as though she were listening not only to what was said, but to what was meant beneath it. Julian had noticed it at their second meeting, across a supper table at the Countess of Ashwick's, when Leonora had said almost nothing all evening, and yet somehow left him with the impression that she had understood everything. He had proposed because his mother required him to marry, because the estate required an heir, and because Leonora Hale was the only woman he had met in 3 seasons who did not make the prospect feel entirely like surrender. Now she appeared at the far end of the nave on her father's arm, and the congregation rose. Sir Geoffrey Hale walked with the careful pride of a man who understood what this day meant, not merely for his daughter, but for his family's place in the world. He was not wealthy. The match had been a stroke of fortune he had scarcely dared hope for, and he carried himself as though the slightest misstep might undo it all. Beside him, Leonora moved with the composure that Julian had come to associate with her, steady, unhurried, her chin lifted just enough to meet the gaze of 300 watching faces without flinching from any of them. She did not look at Julian as she walked. She looked instead at the altar, at the flowers, white roses and trailing jasmine that the Dowager had ordered from the Ashbury glasshouses, and at the vicar, who stood with his prayer book already open. She looked at the light falling through the east window and the dust motes suspended in it like flecks of gold. She looked at everything except the man she was about to marry, and Julian, watching her approach, felt for the first time a flicker of something that was not duty. She reached the chancel rail. Sir Geoffrey placed her hand in Julian's, and her fingers were cold. Julian glanced down at her. She was pale, paler than he remembered from their last meeting, a fortnight ago in her father's drawing room, when she had poured tea with steady hands and discussed the arrangements for the wedding breakfast with a composure that bordered on indifference. Now, in the wash of colored light from the windows, she looked almost translucent, as though the ivory silk of her gown and the ivory of her skin had become the same thing. The vicar began. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered together here in the sight of God, and in the face of this congregation, to join together this man and this woman in holy matrimony." Leonora's hand trembled in his. Julian tightened his grip, not consciously, not with any particular tenderness, but with the instinct of a man who feels something shift beneath him and reaches for the nearest solid thing. He felt the tremor run through her fingers and up through her wrist, and he looked at her face and saw that her eyes had gone very slightly unfocused, as though she were watching something he could not see. Julian Arthur Blackmore, wilt thou have this woman to thy wedded wife, to live together after God's ordinance in the holy estate of matrimony? Wilt thou love her, comfort her, honor and keep her, in sickness and in health? I will, Julian said. The vicar turned to Leonora. Leonora Catherine Hale, wilt thou have this man to thy wedded husband? She opened her mouth. No sound came. Julian saw it happen in the space between one heartbeat and the next, the slight forward sway, the way her eyelids fluttered as though fighting against a weight she could no longer hold, and then the absolute surrender of consciousness, her body folding like a letter being closed, her knees giving way beneath the silk and the petticoats and the careful architecture of a morning's preparation. He caught her before she reached the stone floor. The sound that went through the church was not a gasp. It was something lower, something collective and involuntary, 300 people drawing breath at the same moment. Sir Geoffrey lunged forward. The Dowager Duchess half rose from the front pew, her face a mask of horror that had nothing to do with concern and everything to do with what this looked like, what this meant, what the county would say by evening. Julian did not hear any of it. He was on his knees on the chancel floor with Leonora in his arms, and she weighed nothing. That was the thing that struck him, the thing that would stay with him for months afterwards. She weighed nothing at all, as though the illness she had been hiding had already begun to hollow her out from the inside. Her head fell back against his arm, and he could see the faint blue veins at her temples and the shadows beneath her eyes that the maid's careful work with powder had almost but not quite concealed. "Fetch Dr. Ellsworth," he said. His voice was quiet and carried no panic, which was why every person in the first 6 rows heard it clearly. "He is seated in the 4th pew on the left. Fetch him now." The vicar stood frozen with his prayer book open. Sir Geoffrey was at Julian's side, his hands reaching for his daughter, his face the color of parchment. "She has not been well," Sir Geoffrey said, and the words came out like a confession. "She did not wish anyone to know. She was afraid. She was afraid the match would be called off." Julian looked at him. Something shifted in his expression, not anger, not pity, but a recognition of what it meant that this woman had walked the length of a church aisle on trembling legs rather than risk the loss of something her family needed more than she needed her own health. He stood. He lifted her as he rose, one arm beneath her shoulders and the other beneath her knees, and she was light enough that the effort was nothing. The ivory silk pooled and trailed, the jasmine pinned in her hair had come loose, and a single sprig fell to the stone floor and lay there, small and white and impossibly fragrant. He turned and walked back down the nave. 300 guests watched Julian Blackmore, 5th Duke of Ashbury, carry his unconscious bride past every pew, past every face, past the whispers that had already begun. He did not look at any of them. He did not pause. He walked with the same unhurried steadiness that Leonora herself had shown walking in, as though this were simply what happened next, as though there were no question in his mind about what he was doing or why. The Dowager Duchess called his name. He did not turn. At the church door, Harlow, his steward, who had been waiting outside with the carriages, saw the Duke emerge carrying the bride and understood immediately. He opened the carriage door without being asked. Julian climbed in with Leonora still in his arms and laid her across the seat with her head in his lap. He looked down at her face, at the closed eyes and the faintly parted lips and the terrible, beautiful stillness of her, and he said to Harlow, "Take us to the house. Send Dr. Ellsworth when he comes out. No one else." "The guests, your grace." "No one else." The carriage pulled away from St. Michael's. Behind them, 300 guests remained in their pews, and the vicar stood at the altar with an unfinished service, and the Dowager Duchess sat in the front row with her gloved hands pressed flat against the prayer book in her lap, and the wedding breakfast waited untouched in the great dining room at Ashbury Park, with its crystal and silver, and the flowers that had taken the gardeners 3 days to arrange. Julian did not go back. Dr. Ellsworth arrived at the house 20 minutes after the carriage. He was a man of 60 with steady hands and the particular kind of discretion that came from decades of attending families who valued privacy above almost everything else. He examined Leonora in the blue bedchamber, not the Duchess's rooms which had been prepared for the wedding night with fresh linens and hothouse roses, but the quieter room at the end of the east corridor where the light was gentle and the sounds of the house did not carry. Julian waited in the corridor. He had not changed from his wedding clothes, the dark blue tailcoat, the cream waistcoat, the white cravat that his valet had tied with such precision that morning. He stood with his back against the wall and his arms folded, and he waited with the patience of a man who had discovered, in the space of a single moment, that patience was the only thing required of him. When Ellsworth emerged, his face told Julian most of what he needed to know before a word was spoken. "She has been unwell for some months, Your Grace. She concealed it deliberately." "What is it?" "A condition of the blood. I have seen it before. Fatigue, tremors, episodes of faintness that worsen over time. It is not—" He paused, choosing his words. "It is not necessarily fatal, but it requires rest, proper nourishment, time. She has had none of these things. She has been running on will alone, and today her body simply refused to carry her any further." "Can she recover?" "With the right care, yes. It will take months, perhaps longer. She will need to be still. She will need to be fed well and kept warm and allowed to sleep without anxiety. She will need, Your Grace, to stop being afraid." Julian looked at the closed door of the blue bedchamber. Beyond it, Leonora lay in a bed that was not the one prepared for her, in a house that was not yet hers, wearing a wedding dress from a ceremony that had not been completed. "She was afraid the match would be called off," Julian said. "Her father told me." Ellsworth said nothing. He did not need to. They both understood what it meant for a baronet's daughter with no fortune and a hidden illness to have secured the interest of a duke, and what it would have cost her family to lose it. "I'm not calling it off," Julian said. The dowager arrived an hour later. She came through the front door of Ashbury Park like a storm-making landfall, controlled, purposeful, and impossible to ignore. Mrs. Fenton, the housekeeper, met her in the entrance hall and was immediately dispatched to fetch Julian, who came down from the east corridor still wearing his wedding clothes and an expression that his mother had never seen before and did not know how to read. "The entire county is talking," the dowager said. 300 guests watched you carry that girl out of the church like a man carrying his bride. She is not your bride. The ceremony was not completed." "Then we shall complete it." "Julian." The dowager's voice dropped to the register she reserved for moments when she believed her authority was both necessary and sufficient. "You cannot marry a woman who collapses at the altar. The talk alone—" "I am not interested in talk." "You should be. Your father's debts nearly destroyed this family. We have spent 2 years rebuilding our standing in the county, and I will not see it undone by what? By a woman who walked the length of that church knowing she might fall because she was more afraid of disappointing her family than of her own body failing her." Julian's voice remained level, but something in it had hardened into a material his mother did not recognize. "That is not weakness. That is the opposite of weakness, and I will not punish her for it." The dowager stared at him. She had managed Julian's life with the efficiency of a woman who understood power and wielded it through propriety, expectation, and the careful deployment of silence. She had chosen Leonora Hale from a field of candidates precisely because the girl was quiet, compliant, unlikely to cause difficulty. What she had not anticipated was that the girl's quietness was not compliance but concealment, and that her son would see this and choose it deliberately. "The guests," she began, "have gone home. The breakfast will keep or it will not. I do not care. Julian, I will marry Leonora Hale when she is well enough to stand. If she cannot stand, I will marry her sitting. If she cannot sit, I will marry her lying down. But I will marry her, and I will do it privately, and you will not be in the room unless she wishes it." He turned and went back up the stairs. The days that followed were unlike anything Ashbury Park had known. The great house, which had been prepared for celebration, flowers in every room, the silver polished to mirror brightness, the kitchen stocked for a week of entertaining, settled instead into a quiet so complete that the staff moved through the corridors as though attending a convalescence, which in truth they were. Leonora woke on the second day. She woke to pale morning light and the unfamiliar canopy of the blue bedchamber and the immediate crushing knowledge of what had happened. Mrs. Fenton was the first face she saw, a woman of 50 with kind eyes, and the particular competence of a housekeeper who had served the family through its worst years and did not frighten easily. She brought broth and weak tea and sat in the chair beside the bed without speaking until Leonora was ready. "The Duke," Leonora said. Her voice was thin. His Grace has not left the house since he carried you home," Mrs. Fenton said. "He has taken his meals in his study. He has refused every caller. He has asked after you each morning and each evening and once in between." Leonora closed her eyes. "He must be furious." "He is not furious, my lady." "The ceremony, the guests, his mother." "His Grace carried you out of that church himself, before 300 people, and did not look back. That is not the action of a man who is furious. That is the action of something else entirely." Leonora turned her face into the pillow, and Mrs. Fenton, with the instinct of a woman who understood when to withdraw, gathered the tray and left the room without another word. Julian came to see her that afternoon. He knocked, a detail that Leonora would remember long afterwards, and waited until she said, "Come in," before entering. He had changed out of his wedding clothes at last and wore instead the simple dark coat and buff trousers of a country gentleman at home, and he looked, she thought, like a man who had not slept. He sat in the chair Mrs. Fenton had occupied and looked at her without speaking for a long moment. "You should have told me," he said finally. "If I had told you, the match would have been called off." "By whom?" "By your mother, by the physicians, by anyone who understood what it meant to marry a woman who cannot guarantee." She stopped. The word she could not say hung in the air between them. An heir. "You cannot guarantee an heir," Julian said, completing the sentence she would not. "You think that is what matters to me. It is what matters to your family, to your name. My name survived my father's debts, his disgrace, and 2 years of every drawing room in the county talking about us as though we were already finished. It will survive this." Leonora looked at him, really looked for the first time since their handful of brief formal meetings. She had thought of him as a man performing a role, a duke doing what dukes did, marrying suitably, producing heirs, maintaining the estate. She had not imagined that there might be something beneath the performance that was capable of this, of sitting at her bedside with no expectation, no demand, only the steady willingness to remain. "I will understand," she said carefully, "if you wish to withdraw." "I do not wish to withdraw." "The illness may not. Dr. Ellsworth says it can be managed, but he cannot promise." "Leonora." It was the first time he had used her Christian name. "I carried you out of that church in front of every person who matters in this county. I did not do that to withdraw. I did that because when you fell, the only thing I understood with any clarity was that I did not want anyone else to catch you." She said nothing. There was nothing to say to a sentence like that except to let it settle, which she did, turning it over in the silence the way one turns a stone in the palm to feel its weight. The weeks passed. Leonora stayed in the blue bedchamber because Julian refused to let her be moved to the formal Duchess's rooms until she was strong enough to choose for herself whether she wanted them. Mrs. Fenton brought meals on trays, not the rich dishes of a duke's household, but simple things: clear broth, bread with butter, poached eggs, stewed fruit. Dr. Ellsworth came twice weekly and pronounced cautious satisfaction. The tremor in her left hand diminished. The color returned to her face slowly, like dawn arriving in winter, so gradual that no single day showed the change, but over a fortnight the difference was unmistakable. Julian visited every day. He did not stay long, never more than an hour, and he did not crowd her with conversation. He brought books from the library and left them on the table beside her bed without comment. Volumes of natural history, a translation of Virgil, a slim collection of poems that she discovered he had bookmarked at specific pages with small scraps of paper, each one marking a piece he thought she might like. He was, she realized, courting her, not with the formal gestures of drawing rooms and dance cards, but with the quiet daily attention of a man who had decided that what mattered was not the ceremony but the woman. The dowager did not visit. This was Julian's doing, and he made no effort to disguise it. When his mother sent word through Mrs. Fenton that she wished to see the bride, Julian replied that the bride would receive visitors when she chose to, and not before. The dowager, who had never in her life been classified as a visitor in her own son's house, received this information with a silence that Mrs. Fenton later described to Harlow as the kind that precedes cannon fire. But the cannon fire did not come. Something in Julian's manner since the wedding, the absolute unperformative certainty of his choices, had shifted the balance of the household in ways the dowager could feel but not yet name. She had spent years as the effective mistress of Ashbury Park, governing through her son's deference. That deference had not so much ended as become irrelevant. Julian was not defying her. He was simply no longer consulting her, and the difference was more devastating than any argument could have been. By midsummer, Leonora could walk in the gardens. The weeks of her recovery had their own quiet architecture. Mornings began with Mrs. Fenton drawing back the curtains of the blue bedchamber to let in the light. June light, long and warm, that fell across the floorboards in golden bars and made the room feel less like a sick room and more like a place where someone had chosen to be still. Leonora would sit propped against the pillows while Mrs. Fenton brought the breakfast tray. Toast with honey, a soft-boiled egg, a pot of chamomile tea that Dr. Ellsworth had prescribed and that Leonora drank without complaint, though she privately thought it tasted of nothing at all. The tremor in her hand faded first in the mornings and last in the evenings, so that by the third week she could hold a teacup steady at dawn, but not at dusk, and by the fifth week she could hold it steady at both. Julian's visits acquired a rhythm she came to depend on without admitting it. He arrived after luncheon, usually carrying something, a book, a letter from Sir Geoffrey that he had intercepted at the hall table and brought up himself, once a small jar of strawberry preserves from the kitchen garden that the cook had put up that morning, and that Julian presented with the seriousness of a man delivering state papers. He sat in the chair beside the bed and talked or did not talk, depending on how she seemed, and Leonora discovered that his silences were as deliberate as his words, that he could sit for 20 minutes without speaking and make the silence feel not like absence, but like company. She went out for the first time on a Thursday morning leaning on Mrs. Fenton's arm and made it as far as the rose walk before needing to sit. Julian, who had been attending to estate business with Harlow in his study, saw her from the window and came out without his coat, crossing the lawn in his shirt-sleeves with a lack of formality that would have appalled his mother. He sat beside her on the stone bench at the end of the rose walk and looked out across the park, the long slope of green down to the lake, the avenue of limes, the tenant farms in the distance with their tidy hedgerows and stone walls. "This is yours," he said, "all of it, whether you marry me or not." Leonora looked at him. "That's not how estates work." "It is how this estate works because I say it does." "Your solicitors would disagree." "My solicitors are not sitting on this bench." She laughed, the first time he had heard her laugh, a sound so unexpected and so utterly without pretense that it caught him off guard. He looked at her, and she was looking at the roses, and the morning light was on her face, and he understood with a certainty that had nothing to do with duty or expectation or the requirements of his name that he was going to marry this woman because he wanted to, not because he had agreed to. They married on the 29th of August. The ceremony took place in the private chapel at Ashbury Park, which held 30 people but contained only 7. Julian, Leonora, Sir Geoffrey, Dr. Ellsworth, Mrs. Fenton, Harlow, and the vicar from St. Michael's, who performed the complete service without interruption, and with the particular satisfaction of a man finishing a task that had been left undone. The dowager was not present. Julian had told her of the date and time and left the decision to her. She had chosen to remain in the morning room, which was her right, and Julian had accepted her choice without comment, which was his. Leonora stood for the entire service. Her hand in Julian's did not tremble. Afterwards, they walked from the chapel to the house through the garden, and Mrs. Fenton had laid a small table in the morning room, not the great dining room with its crystal and silver, but the room where the light came in from the south and the windows looked out onto the walled garden. There were white roses in a simple vase, and cold chicken and bread and a cake that the cook had made without being asked because the kitchen had known before anyone else that this day was coming. Sir Geoffrey wept. He did so quietly, in the way of men who have carried a weight for a long time and feel it lift, and Leonora took his hand across the table and held it, and Julian looked at this small gesture, the daughter comforting the father on the day of her own wedding, and added it to the accumulating evidence that he had, through a combination of obligation and accident and something he was only beginning to name, married exactly the right woman. The months that followed were the remaking of Ashbury Park. Leonora did not attempt to displace the dowager. She did something more difficult and more permanent. She simply began to exist within the house as herself, and the house responded. She met with Harlow about the tenant farms and asked questions that revealed she had been reading the estate accounts during her convalescence, not to criticize, but to understand. She walked the grounds with Mrs. Fenton and learned the names of every member of staff and the particular way the house worked, its rhythms and rituals and the unspoken agreements that held a great household together. She did not give orders. She made suggestions, and because her suggestions were invariably sensible and offered without any claim to authority, they were adopted without resistance. The dowager watched this with the wary attention of a woman seeing her own methods used by someone who wielded them more naturally. Leonora was not competing with her. That was what made it so effective and so difficult to oppose. There was no confrontation to win, no argument to settle. There was only a quiet woman moving through the house with increasing confidence, and a household that was turning toward her the way a garden turns toward light. By autumn, the county had stopped talking about the wedding, or rather, had begun talking about it differently. The story that had initially circulated as scandal, the bride who collapsed, the ceremony abandoned, the Duke who walked out, had transformed in the retelling into something that sounded, to the women who passed it between drawing rooms and card tables, remarkably like romance. He carried her out himself. He did not go back. He married her privately when she was well. The women of the county, who understood power and choice and what it meant when a man of rank abandoned propriety for something that looked very much like devotion, revised their assessment of Julian Blackmore entirely. The dowager made her peace in November. It was not a dramatic reconciliation. It was a Tuesday afternoon, and Leonora was in the small sitting room that she had gradually, without announcement, made her own, a room the dowager had never used, which made it unclaimed territory and therefore safe. The dowager appeared at the door and stood for a moment, watching Leonora sort through a basket of mending that Mrs. Fenton had brought up from the servants' hall. "You are mending the servants' linens," the dowager said. "I am sorting them. The mending is done by the seamstress. I am merely deciding what can be repaired and what should be replaced." The dowager looked at her for a long time. "My husband's mother did the same," she said finally. "I had forgotten." She came into the room and sat in the chair opposite, and they spent the afternoon together without speaking of the wedding or the illness, or the 300 guests who had watched her son carry this woman out of a church. They spoke instead of linens and the cost of tallow and whether the east wing chimney needed repointing before winter, and when Mrs. Fenton brought tea, she brought 2 cups without being asked, because Mrs. Fenton always knew before anyone else. Julian found them there at 4:30, sitting in the thin November light with the mending basket between them, and he stood in the doorway for a moment without entering, watching his mother and his wife in the first unguarded silence they had shared. He did not interrupt. The following spring, Leonora told him about the child. She told him in the garden, on the same stone bench where he had once said, "This is yours, whether you marry me or not." It was April, and the roses had not yet bloomed, but the wisteria along the south wall was heavy with pale purple clusters that moved in the breeze like something breathing. "Dr. Ellsworth says I'm well enough," she said. "He says the illness has been in remission for months. He says there is no reason to expect difficulty." Julian looked at the wisteria, and then at his wife, and then at the place where her hand rested against the fabric of her morning dress, and he understood. "When?" he said. "October." He did not speak for a long time. When he did, it was not about the heir or the succession or the name. It was not about the dowager's satisfaction or the county's approval or any of the things that a duke was supposed to care about when told that his line would continue. "Are you afraid?" he said. She considered this. "No," she said. "I was afraid before. When I walked down that aisle, I was afraid of everything, of falling, of being seen, of losing the only thing my father had ever been able to give me. I'm not afraid now." "Why not?" She looked at him. "Because you carried me out." Their daughter was born on the 14th of October, in the blue bedchamber where Leonora had spent her convalescence, attended by Dr. Ellsworth and Mrs. Fenton, and at Leonora's request, the dowager, who held her hand during the final hour and did not once suggest that a son would have been preferable. Julian waited in the corridor in the exact spot where he had stood on the day of the abandoned wedding, and when Mrs. Fenton opened the door and said, "A girl, Your Grace," he walked in and looked at his wife, holding his daughter, and understood that the ceremony in the chapel had been a formality. This was the wedding, this moment, this room, this woman who had nearly fallen and instead had stayed. They named her Catherine after Julian's grandmother, the one the dowager had mentioned, the one who sorted the servants' linens. It was Leonora's suggestion, and the dowager received it with an expression that no one in the household had ever seen before, and that Mrs. Fenton, who saw everything, identified without hesitation as gratitude. 3 years later, the wisteria on the south wall had grown so thick that it covered the entire face of the stone, and Leonora had to have Harlow arrange for the gardeners to cut it back before it reached the bedroom windows. Julian protested. He liked the wisteria. He liked the way it moved in the wind and the way its flowers dropped pale petals onto the gravel path below. But Leonora pointed out that the bees it attracted were finding their way into Catherine's nursery, and Julian conceded immediately, because he had learned by then that Leonora was almost always right about the things that mattered, and the conceding to her was not weakness, but the simplest form of intelligence. The county still told the story. It had become, by then, one of those tales that belonged to the landscape as much as to the family. The bride who fainted, the duke who carried her out, the 300 guests who waited for a groom who never came back. Young women heard it and sighed. Their mothers heard it and reconsidered what they thought they knew about duty and choice, and the difference between a man who performs his role and a man who discovers in a single unplanned moment what his role actually is. At Ashbury Park, the story was simpler. It was the sound of Catherine running through the corridors with Mrs. Fenton in gentle pursuit. It was the dowager reading aloud in the sitting room while Leonora sewed. It was Julian standing at the window of his study, watching his wife walk through the rose garden in the late afternoon light, and knowing that the tremor in her hand had not returned, and that the blue bedchamber was now the guest room, and that the great dining room was used again for dinners, and that the chapel where they had married held 30 people but had needed only 2. And when new stories arrived, as they always did, finding their way through the quiet hours like a voice remembered from a room one had only just left, they arrived here, like a breath drawn after a long silence, whenever they were ready.